Hey, what's going on, guys? So in this video I wanted to basically demystify fat loss. So the tips we're going to talk about today you can use to either lose like 1 pound of fat or 200 pounds of fat. It's kind of like all the same at the end of the day if you just practice these rules, because every pound of fat you lose is basically just the same exact rules you have to follow for every other pound of fat. And I think today it's gotten way too complicated online in terms of like how to actually go about losing body fat. You have like 1,000,005 different diets, 1,000,005 different approaches. But I'm just going to cover a few basic principles that you can just apply, and you will 100% have success in your fat loss journey. So I have like a few notes here, so I'll just kind of go down the list, and that's that. So just once again, apply these principles. It's very straightforward, and I will 100% guarantee you will have a successful fat loss journey if you just do these steps. So first and foremost, the main thing you have to do is establish a very minor caloric deficit. And this is dramatically overlooked by anyone. Like, you can do the paleo diet, fasting, be on a vegan diet or whatever, but if there is no minor caloric deficit, I'm not saying it has to be huge, but if there isn't a minor caloric deficit, you will not lose any body fat. End of story. So that deficit could be created through diet, or it could be created through more physical activity, or like usually a combination between a bit more physical activity and a bit better eating habits that establish like a slight caloric deficit. So for example, if you're in a 500 calorie daily deficit, you will most definitely lose about 1 pound of fat per week. Typically, like, a single pound of fat is going to be 3,500 calories. So once again, if you're in that very minor caloric deficit of 500 calories per day, you will predictably lose 1 pound of fat per week. Given a few circumstances, that rule applies just across the board, and we'll cover those other few circumstances in a second, okay? So that's the main thing. And in fact, like, a lot of these diets, like fasting, paleo, keto, the 1,000,005 other diets that exist, the only reason they work for most people is because they put them in a slight caloric deficit. Basically, they just eliminate certain food groups, like, for instance, from the carnivore diet, people lose weight on it because they've eliminated pretty much everything but meat. So that takes away like a tremendous amount of calories from various food sources. A paleo diet, you just eliminate a bunch of grains, for example, okay? And like various industrial cooking oils. So once again, that just eliminates a large bulk of available calories you have, thus making it more likely to put you in a caloric deficit, which is what's going to cause that weight loss, or that fat loss rather. And even fasting, it just restricts the time frame of when you could actually eat food, making it less likely for you to eat a lot of food throughout the day. Thus, what's the result of that? You're just eating slightly less amount of food, or even a lot less food, which once again puts you in a caloric deficit, and that is why you lose weight, or lose body fat rather. So you do have to have that minor caloric deficit, and to have that minor, and there's no way about it, no ifs or buts about it, if you do want predictable fat loss, you have to have that minor caloric deficit, and more importantly, you have to keep track of your calories, which is another big mistake a lot of people make, keeping track of your calories or just food intake in general. So that's the next step we're going to cover, is basically people don't keep track of their food, and this makes weight loss unpredictable, and people get demoralized because some weeks they might lose, like 1, 2, 3 pounds, and then maybe 3 or 4 weeks goes by and the person doesn't lose any weight at all, and they're like, oh, that's it, I hit a plateau, and basically I'm not going to lose any weight, it's because of my genetics, blah blah blah. Well, in reality, it's because you didn't establish a weekly caloric average deficit. And you didn't establish a weekly caloric average deficit by simply not keeping track of your calories and macro, or just food intake in general. Because, like, for example, it's a little deceptive. Like, 1 tablespoon of olive oil is about like 110 to 120 calories. So a lot of times people don't even know how to keep track of their calories. It's also important to keep track of your calories in the sense of weighing your food or measuring your food in its raw state. So it makes it a lot easier to manage, the accounting portion a lot easier to manage in my opinion. And also the calories a lot more predictable too, because you have it in its raw state. People oftentimes underestimate the amount of calories there are in sauces, seasonings, etc., etc. And we covered in terms of how many calories there are just in a single tablespoon of olive oil, and oftentimes people don't count those at all. And if you're super physically active, it's not too big of a deal. However, the average person isn't that physically active, so they don't have that huge buffer of room to not be precise with these numbers because they're not burning that many calories to begin with. Oftentimes they're just sitting all day and staring at a computer, which kind of puts them in this hypnotic state and actually for the most part decreases their base metabolism, actually below their base metabolic needs. Because you're in this kind of hypnotic state, your organ system slow down, everything slows down, so you're even burning less calories, slightly bit less calories than if you were just, for instance, being a couch potato and sitting on a bed and just kind of reading a book or something like that. So that's super important to consider, being exact with your measurements on top of having to establish that caloric deficit on a daily basis. And I did cover the caloric weekly caloric average. That number is very important. It's obviously important to have that daily caloric deficit, but the weekly caloric average is also extremely important as well, because sometimes people can be hitting the amount of calories they need to hit, let's say 6 days a week, but on one of the days they have some family members or whatever show up and all of a sudden they eat a lot more, okay? And because once again, most people aren't extremely physically active. I mean, 1 hour of workouts in the gym doesn't burn that many calories, especially if you kind of combine that with sitting for 8 to 10 hours doing computer work. It's just not enough to really kind of get you burning a tremendous amount of calories. And if you're not diligent with then tracking the calories, weight loss or fat loss becomes very unpredictable at that point. Most likely, you might have some short-term results, but long-term, it's not going to happen, okay? And basically, so for that one day, on a Saturday, let's say you have like a lot more calories than you did on all the other days. On average, if you kind of added all the calories throughout the week and divided by 7, your weekly caloric average, which is a very important number, actually puts you in a surplus, not a deficit. You want your weekly caloric average to be putting you in a deficit on a consistent basis. And that's what's going to consistently allow you to lose a predictable amount of body fat week after week after week after week. And I've done this with already hundreds of clients successfully. It's a system that 100% works if you're diligent with it. There's no mysticism behind it, okay? It's just kind of basic math, first law of thermodynamics, and it just works. I don't know what to say. I don't know why it's gotten so complicated on the internet these days. Well, I do know it's for marketing reasons, because people try to confuse you into making you believe it's complicated, so you buy their product, you buy into their diet, etc., etc. But trust me, I've used this system successfully to get people to lose 20, 30, 40 to even 100 pounds. You can check out the testimony section on my website, and it's full of successful transformation programs of people of various backgrounds, etc., etc. So it just works. Just give it a try, and trust me, you will be successful. Third, make sure your sourcing is very good. So remember the first few things, you want that slight caloric deficit. You want to make sure your weekly caloric average puts you in a deficit. And you want to make sure you're accurately tracking your calories and your food intake in general. But another step you want to do is you want to make sure you're sourcing high quality food. That's also another huge key. So ideally, I mean, the best scenario is going to be like wild game, wild fish, and wild crops. But most people are going to be dependent on farmed foods. So farmed animals, domesticated animals rather, farmed animals, and farmed crops, okay? So in that case, what you want is you want to make sure the animals you're sourcing aren't fed grains. So you want to make sure basically they're raised on pasture and, more importantly, fed a species-specific diet. I cover this in a lot of videos, and I've recently written an article for Ben Greenfield about this that covers in a lot more detail. You could also check out my interview on Paul Chek's Living 4D podcast about this subject. I'll try to link it in the description as well. But basically, you want to be sourcing animals that are fed a species-specific diet because it helps establish a much more ideal omega-3 to omega-6 ratio, which is going to be more conducive to your fat loss goals. So if you want to kind of be lean, be ripped all year round, you don't want your diet to be full of highly inflammatory food groups, such as animals that are fed grains, which is pretty much any chicken, pork, and turkey found at the supermarket is going to be 100% reliant on heavy amounts of grain. Even if it says free range organic, it's still going to be like heavily reliant on grain-fed operations. So because that's not a species-specific diet for those animal groups, you're going to get a tremendous amount of omega-6 in relation to omega-3, and omega-6 is a pro-inflammatory micronutrient, and the last thing you want is more inflammation in your body when you're trying to lose a lot of body fat, when you're trying to look very lean, and when you want to have six-pack abs. So on top of that, make sure you're sourcing at least USDA certified organic fruits and vegetables at the grocery store, because you don't want to be eating conventionally farmed crops for a myriad of reasons. One is they usually almost always come from a single crop farming system, which makes them nutritionally inferior. This makes it more likely for you to overeat, because the food that you are eating is not nutritionally dense. Your body knows it needs more nutrients, so it's going to constantly trick your mind into thinking you're hungry, to constantly keep trying to eat more food to get those nutrients in its body to increase its chances of survival. It's a very basic kind of genetic predisposition that allowed you to survive this long already, okay? But the problem is the food supply these days is not as good as it was like a few hundred years ago, for example, or even compared to even before farming came around, okay? It's definitely, there's definitely a lot of holes in it, but USDA organic, certified USDA organic is also important to buy, because you are going to decrease your exposure to synthetic biocides of various sorts. And this is 100% true. I mean, there are many, many studies that show that the USDA organic program, although it doesn't necessarily provide nutritionally dense food, it does provide you food that is free of synthetic biocides, which in and of itself is enough of a reason to purchase that food. Because the less burden you put on your body, the stronger your immune system will be, okay? And the more resources your immune system will have to actually help you lose that body fat you want to lose and have those six-pack abs that you want to have, or have that lean midsection you want to have, or just lean body or healthy body in general. Another thing is, the more toxicity you incorporate, or the more toxicity you introduce into your diet, or into your body through your diet, the more fat stores your body has to create to take those toxins away from its organ system and deposit them on the outside of your body. So basically keeping your organs safe for the most part. So once again, the higher the toxic load, the higher the body fat percentage will be, okay? Because your body has to create those fat stores to store those toxins to allow you to keep living. So that's another reason to kind of at least buy certified USDA organic fruits and vegetables. Another step is water, okay? This is huge in the fat loss process. So a lot of times when people overeat, in reality, what is happening is they're actually just thirsty. People are chronically dehydrated, especially in the US. And what happens, water is the most important nutrient your body can possibly have, so keep that in mind. And what happens when your body is in need of water and it's not getting it, it tricks your mind into believing that you're hungry so that you can eat food groups that also have water in them. So for instance, like fruits and vegetables have like a tremendous amount of water content in them. Even meat has a tremendous amount of water content in it as well. So it will trick your mind into believing it's hungry. So it goes after and eats that food and then gets water from there. But in reality, you're just really thirsty, okay? And all you really needed at the end of the day was just a lot more water. So that's another very important key thing to take away when you're when you're trying to lose body fat from 1 to 200 pounds. It doesn't matter. All these rules apply for every single pound lost. Another key step is you want to make sure you're mastering your sleeping cycle. This is huge for a myriad of reasons, but especially for your fat loss goal as well, because it helps balance out your hormonal system, okay? Generally, you want to make sure you're sleeping between the hours of 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. That's a good rule to follow by. And you want to make sure your sleeping hygiene is really good, because a lot of times people would say like, oh yeah, I sleep between those hours, but then you look at their sleeping log and it's like they might actually do that maybe 3 or 4 days out of the week, but then the rest of the time it's like they go to sleep at midnight for one reason or another, or at 1 a.m. for one reason or another, and they wake up later and the rhythm is all out of whack. So as a general rule, try to go to sleep like it depends on your personality too, because if you're a type A and your personality, that's a very stressful job, and your central nervous system is amped up through the roof, you might need to go to sleep a lot earlier. For example, so in that case, if you are that individual, you might need to be in bed by 9 p.m. if you want to already be sleeping by 10 p.m. and you want to be doing something like very relaxing, like reading a book under preferably like an Edison light, none of these like huge like industrial lights that produce like a lot of artificial lights, which is going to decrease your melatonin, especially if you're already staring at a screen all day. That's going to decrease your melatonin production a tremendous amount already. Then combine that with being exposed to artificial lights from like your phone, for example, or your laptop right before bed, and then all of a sudden it becomes like very tough for your body to actually wind down and go to sleep. So that's another huge important pillar of having a successful fat loss journey. In terms of workouts, honestly, the best thing you can do for fat loss is just have low intensity dynamic movement like all day. So for example, like this isn't realistic for most, but I'm just kind of showing it as an example of what you can do. Like construction work would be an example of something like that, or like farming work, where it's not like too intense in and of itself. It's not like doing a 1 rep deadlift or something like that, but it is kind of manual labor and it's low intensity work that's done basically all day. So as a general rule, I don't know these numbers exactly, it's been a while since I've researched it, but let's just say you have two people that are exactly the same. So you have one doing computer work, for example, and then one doing construction work. So the construction worker, and let's just say they work 10-hour shifts, the construction worker will burn like 200 to 300 calories an hour on top of their base metabolic rate, which is, let's say, like 2,000 calories. Where the computer programmer, because they're kind of staring at this screen all day, they're kind of put into this hypnotic state, will most likely burn actually below their base metabolism. So they're probably burning, let's say, this is just hypothetical, of course, 1,900 calories a day. So you have the construction worker that's burning 200 calories as their base metabolism, but then on top of that working a 10-hour shift that allows them to burn 300 calories per hour, so they're burning an extra 3,000 calories that day. So they burned a total of 5,000 calories that day, where the computer programmer burned a total of 1,900 calories, for example. Of course, there's like a tremendous amount of variability, but I'm trying to simplify it as much as possible to kind of just to give you the point of that low intensity dynamic movement, the huge advantage it gives you in terms of total amount of calories burned per day. Now, for aesthetics, when you're really trying to improve the visual appearance for your body, I think the best way to do that is through weightlifting, because you can kind of customize how you're trying to transform your body. So let's say you have like a square-shaped body, okay? Then one thing you can do to get that V-taper on top of losing the body fat is also work on enhancing the width of the shoulders and the width of the back. So in that example, you would do a lot of overhead presses or do a lot of dumbbell laterals, for example, just to increase that medial head to give you more of that wider shoulder appearance. That way it gives you more of an optical illusion of having a V-tapered physique, which gives you more of that ripped abs type of look. And then the lats as well, okay? Let's say you want that V-taper, you need to have very wide lats, so you need to be doing a lot of pull-ups then, or a lot of pull-downs with the cable pull-down machine, for example. And that once again will contribute also to that V-tapered appearance as well. So you can see how it's very customizable depending on how you want to visually transform your physique. That's why weightlifting provides a great advantage there, and also provides enough stimulus for the muscle to grow a lot as well. Like a lot more than you're going to get from, for example, yoga. I'm not saying it's not effective at aesthetically changing your body, but when you really want to kind of like maximize that aesthetic appeal and have that muscle growth, just look at what all those guys in the magazines, like fitness magazines with the ripped abs or very symmetric physiques, or very aesthetic physiques rather, aesthetically muscular physiques are doing. They're lifting weights, okay? And they usually lift weights like four to 5 times a week minimum. On top of doing a lot of lifestyle stuff, the weightlifting part is just kind of like a supplementary in the grand scheme of things, but that's what they are doing workout-wise, okay? Now, another very key important thing to remember in having a successful fat loss journey, and this is the one variable that's dramatically overlooked by pretty much everyone, is decreasing low-grade chronic stress. So a great book you can check out is Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. Dr. Robert Lepowski, I believe. It's been a long time since I've read that book, but basically the human central nervous system hasn't evolved well to deal with low-grade chronic stress. The stuff that kind of doesn't matter too much. I mean, it's not too stressful, but it happens like every single day, and it's constant, it's all the time. Because a lot of times people are like, oh, you don't have anything to stress out about, like this isn't life-threatening. But ironically, the human central nervous system actually adapted better to be, like, for example, attacked by a lion in the middle of a safari, like having this hunt with the lion where you and your tribesmen are throwing spears at the lion and it's kind of like attacking you, and your adrenaline kind of, or cortisol, goes through the roof for a few minutes while that hunt is on. But then basically like 5 months go by without anything like that happening, or any kind of stress response happening whatsoever, because you're kind of just hanging out in your tribe, sleeping under a tree, or like fishing in the morning or something like that. So it's like a very balanced out environment. But today, let's just go through the average person. Like, what does the average person do? He wakes up chronically tired, so your cortisol is already through the roof because they've been drinking probably coffee all day. What do they do in the beginning of the day when they're already tired? They drink more coffee. That's going to shoot your cortisol up higher, and in the morning your cortisol is already kind of typically higher for the average person. They're going to get in the car, you're going to drive through traffic, people are honking at them, they need to switch lanes, that's bumping up your cortisol even more. They get to work, average person does not enjoy their work, they have cortisol production there. Cortisol production with deadlines, so they have like these deadlines coming up, maybe a boss they don't like, that's going to shoot their cortisol through the roof as well. They miss a deadline, cortisol, you get written up by your company, cortisol goes through the roof. You come home, or you drive home then, or you're eating highly inflammatory foods at lunch, most likely because you're eating out, and all those restaurants cooking inflammatory seed oils. You drive home, hit traffic again, you're already kind of tired, you're in a fatigue state, so now that traffic is even more anxiety producing, more cortisol producing, because when you're in a fatigue state, everything is seen as kind of like more stressful, or everything is perceived as more stressful. So once again, cortisol goes through the roof, you get home, probably eat a highly inflammatory meal again, maybe you have some financial issues, etc. So you get the point, it's constant. Any one of those things isn't too big of a deal. But what really destroys the health of a person and suppresses their immune system and increases their cortisol, which kind of increases fat accumulation around the chest, lower chest, around the midsection, the butt, it kind of changes over time the shape of your body into more of like a pear, okay? Where if you had a controlled hormonal system, a good HPA regulation, you would have more over equal fat distribution through your body instead of having it just dramatically centered around like the torso area of your body, like the lower abs, the chest, the lower chest, etc., etc. So then you would have to dive deeper. Okay, so yes, in terms of returning back to that, you would want to eliminate those little teeny chronic stresses. But the bigger question is, why does a person continue that lifestyle of self-abuse when clearly the bulk majority of people don't like that, and it's causing them to gain a tremendous amount of weight, preventing them from shedding that weight, from having that ideal physique they want, Why would that abuse occur? Because that kind of appearance of her body, a lot of times fat gain is seen just as an aesthetic problem. So, oh, that fatness does not look attractive. But really, that tremendous amount of fat gain is a byproduct of mental and physical distress that happens in the person's body that leads to a tremendous amount of inflammation in the person's body chronically that leads to all that fat gain. So the person is suffering tremendously mentally and physically, which leads to that heightened cycle, which leads to all that fat gain. Okay, and then you would ask, why would a person continue to do that? And basically, we covered this in a few other videos, so I'm not going to cover it extensively here. It most always falls down to three variables, which go back to a single umbrella variable, which we'll cover after these three. Basically, one is there is definitely a love-hate relationship present in the person's life. So like I mentioned before, a typical one is kind of like, we've been married 10 years, I love this person initially, but I no longer love them, but we're staying together for one reason or another. This creates kind of like a stress response. You combine that with driving to work, hitting that traffic, not hitting those deadlines, being at a job maybe you don't like being. Cortisol is once again shooting through the roof like crazy. Then you get home and you're with a person that you're kind of have to be fake around. So you no longer love this person, but you're with them, and this causes a lot of bitterness. Once again, HPA regulation is kind of thrown off track. Cortisol goes through the roof, etc., etc. Fat gain arises. Also, people seek out food in that case to gain comfort or that love that they don't have in that relationship as well. That's a huge psychological variable to consider also. Another one, number two, is, and I'm kind of briefly going over this, there's a lot more that goes into any one of these variables, okay, which we'll do an extensive video on in the future, but I just wanted to generally cover some base marks of how a person can go about successfully losing body fat and then kind of developing the ideal body they want, and more importantly, developing that for lasting change. Not kind of like losing the body fat, 20 or 30 pounds, and then gaining it all back basically 2 years later, which 99% of people do in body transformation programs. So these three variables that we're touching on, this is where you kind of create that lasting change by getting to the etiology or the root cause of why you gained all that weight to begin with and why it's so hard to lose to begin with, you know? So, because objectively speaking, fat loss is extremely easy. But when you take into consider human psychology and self-sabotaging behavior, that's when it becomes extremely extremely complicated. That's where the complexity in fat loss comes in. Not how you should structure your macros or how many calories you should have or where your workout or how your workout should be structured. That stuff's all very easy and surface level stuff. But that's not why people gain all that fat to begin with. Not because they don't know like what food to be eating or how to structure their calories. There's a small percentage of people for sure that fit into that category, but it's a very small percent. So the second one is basically there's a story gap. Once again, you want to be this type of person in the world. This is who you know you are, but you're a completely different type of person because of necessity. Like you don't feel safe expressing who you really are in the real world. And this causes a tremendous amount of stress, internal stress that's chronic, it's insidious, it's constant. Once again, like we mentioned, the central nervous system isn't well adapted to have that low-grade chronic stress. Cortisol is through the roof, HPA regulation is thrown off track. Once again, a person is more likely then to seek out food as a source of comfort, as a source of control. Fat gain arises, and the cycle continues. And the third variable is a feeling of emptiness inside. That's huge as well. Like sometimes people didn't do the deep work necessary to find out who they are, so they constantly feel empty inside. No matter what they do, they don't feel like themselves, and they don't feel like they could safely express like who they are in the real world because they don't know who they are. And this once again creates that stress response that we talked about. It's all the same, but these are the three kind of culprits, and they arise. Then the next question is, why would a person do all this to themselves? Well, because basically they don't know their core values, and they never invest. Sorry guys, camera kind of broke up there. It said I exceeded the limit, so that's an indication that I've been talking too much. So I'm going to try to close this one up right now. But basically, core values. Core values are the base of basically a successful fat loss program. And you need your core values to be aligned with a health conscious lifestyle as well. So, for example, let's say you only like working 3 days a week. This is actually how I enjoy working. So for example, like I become very miserable when I have to work 50, 60 hours a week. I could do it, but it just makes me miserable. So if I didn't listen to my core values of basically I like working 3 days a week and then reading, studying a lot, doing videos like this and helping people, etc., and I need a lot more time to do all that stuff. So if I'm working 5 or 6 days a week, my core values aren't being met in that regards, and that sets up a stress response. Once again, that sets up that whole entire cycle we've just talked about before. Okay, so it's important to know your core values, and then sometimes it might be scary to live them out, but it is very important for long-term health and long-term fat loss to be able to follow through with those core values. If you want a great product is Paul Chek's Living Your Legacy DVD. I keep meaning to research the name of it, but or remind myself the name of it before doing these shows, but I'm pretty sure you can find it online. And it basically is like, I don't know, it's like 8 to 10 hours long, and it basically goes over the importance of having established core values, because they lay the foundation, the blueprint to everything you do in life. And the closer you are aligned to those core values, the better your fat loss journey will be, and the longer lasting your results will be as well. Okay, that way you don't run into these yo-yo effects of losing 20 or 30 pounds and then kind of gaining it back, which typically happens, which most always happens 99% of times, of people that just focus on working out and nutrition when it comes to fat loss. And that's why you rarely see lasting change in any of these transformation programs. So I hope this video helps. Please leave your comments below and I'll try my best to answer them.